The Linguaverse episode 15, The Future of the Spell Arc 2, The Future and Philosophy of Language. Welcome back to the Linguaverse. If you've been journeying with me from Arc 1 through Arc 2, you'll know that the thread of the spell has been here from the very beginning. From the first words spoken by early humans to name the unseen, to the ways modern institutions wield phrases like weapons, the spell has always been central to language. This is episode 15, The Future of the Spell, and it's one of the most crucial episodes in this entire project. Because the question we've circled again and again is not whether language carries power, but what happens when that power mutates. The spell isn't just about sorcerers, witches, or incantations. It's about the act of speech that changes reality. Every time a judge says guilty, a life changes. Every time a doctor says bipolar or autistic, an identity shifts. Every time an algorithm flags a word, a message disappears. The spell is the mechanism by which language doesn't just describe the world, but enacts it. We've already seen this across earlier episodes. In the ineffable, we recognize the limits of speech, where silence does the work words cannot. But even silence can be a spell, a presence that redefines a room. In language and consciousness, we saw how words don't just mirror thought, they scaffold awareness, shaping inner life itself. Spells, then, are the crystallization of this process, concentrated speech acts that bind, direct, or liberate. In language and reality, we confronted how social consensus, propaganda, and discourse themselves are spells, building the scaffolds of our everyday world. Now in episode 15, I want to take us forward, into the future, into what happens when spell work leaves the domain of ritual and religion and becomes embedded in law, science, media, and algorithms, into what happens when every word we speak is tracked, filtered, predicted, and turned into a feedback loop. Because the future of the spell isn't just about occult rituals, though they still matter. It's about whether we can see the spells we're already under. It's about whether we notice how phrases like mental health disorder, national security, breaking news, or terms of service work on us the way ancient incantations once did. And it's also about whether we can break them, or better yet, whether we can cast our own. To get there, we need to move through layers. First, the ancient spell, where words were openly magical, ritualized, and communal. Then, the scientific and diagnostic spell, the language of medicine, psychology, and authority that enchants us into categories. Next, the political spell, propaganda, and power disguised as truth. Then, the algorithmic spell, where machines become spellcasters, automating enchantment. And finally, how we might break and recast spells, reclaiming language for ourselves. Today's journey begins with the most ancient layer, not because it's archaic or irrelevant, but because what we think of as primitive spell work never disappeared. It's alive in every contract, every prayer, every courtroom, every swear word, every meme. It's the substrate upon which all modern spells are built. So let's step back. Before algorithms, before diagnoses, before propaganda. Let's walk into firelit caves, into temples, into medieval courts, into our own kitchens, where we still say bless you when someone sneezes. Let's rediscover what it means to speak as if words could change the world, because they always have, and they still do. The ancient spell. When most people hear the word spell, they think of witches muttering incantations, of wands raised, of cauldrons bubbling. But strip away the costumes and fiction, and a spell is simply this: a word or phrase spoken with intention, believed to enact change. That definition alone makes clear why spells never vanished. They were never confined to occult rituals. They are contracts, oaths, curses, blessings, mantras, diagnoses, declarations, hashtags. The ancient spell still haunts the modern world, wearing new clothes. Words as breath and force. In many ancient cultures, breath and word were inseparable. The Hebrew Bible tells us that God breathed life into Adam. The word for spirit, ruah, also means breath. In Vedic tradition, the sacred syllable carried vibration that aligned the chanter with cosmic order. In ancient Egypt, Heka referred to the magical power of speech itself, not just ritual, but the very ability of words to animate matter. What fascinates me is how universal this belief was. Across continents, the earliest human societies intuited that words were not neutral labels. They were forces. To name was to summon, to call forth. To curse was to wound, to bless was to protect. Even today, fragments remain when we say, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. We are lying to ourselves. Words wound, sometimes more deeply than sticks or stones. Ancient people knew this. They built whole systems of power around it. Incantation and repetition. One of the core features of spells is repetition. Say a word once, and it's a statement. Say it 3 times, and it becomes an incantation. In ritual magic, repetition builds rhythm, which alters consciousness. The spell is not just about meaning, it's about sound, vibration, cadence. Chanting fight, fight, fight isn't logical, it's physiological. It creates resonance in the body, synchrony in the group. We still do this today. Think of political rallies. Yes, we can. Lock her up. 4 more years. Think of advertising slogans repeated until they burrow into memory. Think of pop songs where the chorus repeats like a mantra until you can't get it out of your head. This is spell work in modern form. Words don't just pass meaning, they entrain bodies and minds. Oaths and contracts, as spells a courtroom, is one of the most overtly magical spaces in modern life. You walk in, and by speaking specific formulas, I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, you bind yourself. If you break the oath, you face punishment. The judge then speaks guilty or not guilty, and with those words, reality changes. You might walk free, or you might lose years of your life. Contracts work the same way. Two people sign their names on a page, and suddenly obligations, debts, and responsibilities spring into existence. Nothing physical changes, but socially, legally, and materially, the world is different. This is pure spellcraft. Words once uttered or inscribed bind reality. Everyday spells, even outside formal rituals, we live among spells. We say bless you when someone sneezes, a survival of ancient beliefs that sneezes expelled the soul or let spirits in. We avoid saying certain curses, fearing they jinx us. We say I love you, not just as a description, but as a performative act. The saying itself creates the bond. These are spells stripped of robes and candles. Everyday incantations we perform without thinking. Curses, swearing, and taboo. One of the clearest traces of ancient in language is swearing. To curse someone is literally to cast a spell against them. Even in modern times, swear words carry visceral force. Stub your toe and the expletive bursts out, not because it's logical, but because the word itself channels emotion, pain, and aggression. Linguist Steven Pinker calls this the emotive function of swearing. It bypasses rational meaning and hits directly at the nervous system, which is why swearing relieves pain, increases endurance, and intensifies emotional expression. Ancient societies would not have been surprised. They already knew words carried force. The survival of magical thinking. Some argue that modern society has outgrown magical thinking, but I don't buy it. I think magical thinking just wears new clothes. We still talk about manifesting. We still believe that saying something aloud makes it more likely to happen. We still avoid jinxing ourselves by speaking too confidently. Athletes wear lucky socks. Students avoid uttering failure before an exam. These are vestiges of the ancient spell. They survive because they are woven into the psychology of language itself. Personal reflection. Where I saw the spell when I began working on the Inversiverse and later the Linguaverse, I noticed how often I would describe words themselves as if they had agency. It wasn't just words describe reality. It was words do reality. That insight didn't come from abstract theory. It came from lived experience, seeing how certain phrases stuck, spread, bound people, and liberated people. I think back to moments where silence broke me open, my own awakening in stillness. That experience felt ineffable at the time, beyond words. And yet, as soon as I began writing about it, I realized I was casting my own kind of spell. Not a spell to persuade, but a spell of reflection, language as a mirror. That's when I began to see all languages this way. Every podcast, every book, every sentence is not just communication. It's spell work. Sometimes gentle, sometimes sharp, sometimes unconscious, but always world-shaping. So if ancient incantations, oaths, curses, and blessings are still alive in our everyday speech, what happens when we add the authority of science and institutions on top? What happens when the spell no longer looks like abracadabra, but like you have depression, or this is the law, or the data shows? That's where we turn next, to the scientific and diagnostic spell. Because the most powerful spells today are not spoken in temples, but in hospitals, schools, and labs. And unless we learn to see them, we won't know how they shape us. The scientific and diagnostic spell. If the ancient spell lived in chants and oaths, the modern spell hides in something more subtle, authority. We no longer bow before a priest or oracle to receive the word that defines our lives. We bow before expert systems and diagnostic categories. The robes are white coats. The temples are clinics, classrooms, labs, and courtrooms. The incantations are charts, data points, and technical language that claim neutrality, but bind us nonetheless. Science is often framed as the antidote to superstition, the great unveiling of nature from the fog of myth. But science, too, has always needed language. And the way it names, defines, and classifies is not neutral description. It is spell work. It turns categories into realities, labels into identities, numbers into truths. I call this the scientific and diagnostic spell. Because the words of science don't just describe phenomena, they enchant them into being. The spell of classification, when Carl Linnaeus published Systema Naturae in the 18th century, he wasn't just cataloguing plants and animals. He was casting one of the most enduring spells of the modern world, taxonomy. To classify is to order reality. To give a name is to bind. Linnaeus sorted life into kingdoms, genera, and species. His Latin terms became global standards. From then on, to study nature was not just to observe, but to speak within this enchanted system of categories. The same spell work appears in medicine. Hippocrates and Galen once diagnosed illness by humours. Modern physicians diagnose with ICD codes. Either way, the authority rests in naming. You have influenza. You have diabetes. These are not just labels. They change how you experience your body, how society treats you, what treatments you receive, and how insurance pays. Linguists would call this the performative function of language, J.L. Austin's famous notion of the speech act. To say I now pronounce you husband and wife is not to describe, but to enact. In the same way, to say you are depressed is to enact a reality, one that carries consequences well beyond description. The DSM as modern grimoire nowhere is this clearer than in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM. On the surface, it is a handbook, a technical reference for psychiatrists and psychologists, but in practice it is closer to a grimoire, a book of spells. Each entry is an incantation, major depressive disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, bipolar 2. These terms, when spoken by someone with authority, alter lives. I remember my own assessments. The questions seemed so mechanical, so detached from context. Did you play alone as a child? Did you struggle with focus? Did your mood fluctuate? Each yes or no became a brick in a structure that would soon have a name. And once spoken, you have autism. You have ADHD. You have bipolar type 2. It was as if the words themselves rewrote my history. My childhood silences were no longer just moments of solitude. They were retroactively symptoms. My moods were no longer just tides of experience. They were diagnostic criteria. This is spell work, not evil in itself. Sometimes diagnostic labels open doors to treatment, accommodation, and community. But the enchantment is double-edged. For many, the spell collapses identity into pathology. They begin to say, I'm bipolar, I'm ADHD, as though the label defines the totality of the self. And the danger is not just personal. Society takes these labels and weaves them into discourse. Statistics about rising autism prevalence, debates about overdiagnosis, casual remarks that everyone is ADHD these days. The spell of the DSM spreads until entire populations are redefined by its terms, pathologizing the human. One of the most insidious features of the scientific spell is pathologization, the transformation of ordinary human behaviors into symptoms of disorder. A child who prefers solitude is no longer simply shy, introspective, or cautious. They are socially withdrawn. A teenager who resists authority is no longer simply defiant in spirit. They have oppositional defiant disorder. An adult who swings between energy and exhaustion is no longer simply living through cycles. They may have bipolarity. Each of these redefinitions strips away ambiguity, nuance, and context. And once the diagnostic spell is spoken, alternatives fade. It is no longer enough to say this child is shy. The category has been enchanted into existence. This child has autism. Foucault, in The Birth of the Clinic, argued that medical language doesn't just describe bodies, it produces them as objects of knowledge and control. To be seen through the medical gaze is to be spoken into a new form of existence. The DSM is a crystallization of that process, language as a totalizing filter, the spell of objectivity. What gives scientific spells their force is the aura of objectivity. Numbers, graphs, statistics, they appear neutral, beyond bias. But objectivity itself is a linguistic performance, a spell that convinces us of inevitability. Consider a blood test. The result comes back, 140 milligrams DL. That number is meaningless until someone defines the threshold. Above 126, diabetes. Below, normal. The word attaches to the number and reality shifts. The same with IQ tests, personality inventories, and diagnostic checklists. The numbers feel solid, but their meaning is woven by consensus, by institutions, by discourse. Objectivity is not the absence of magic, it is magic disguised as neutrality. Linguist John Lucy, studying linguistic relativity, noted how categories in language channel perception. Scientific categories do the same, but with the authority of mathematics. They don't just highlight reality, they reframe it. Jargon as enchantment, every discipline has its jargon. Biochemistry, law, and economics, each field develops words that are incomprehensible to outsiders. At first glance, jargon is practical, a shorthand for precision. But it also functions as a spell. It marks insiders and outsiders, creates awe and submission. Think of a doctor rattling off Latin terms. The patient nods, intimidated. The language itself performs authority. The patient may not understand, but they trust or fear. The spell has been cast. This is why Orwell, in Politics and the English Language, warned of jargon as obfuscation. Bureaucracies thrive on words that conceal more than they reveal. A government doesn't say, we killed civilians, it says collateral damage. The enchantment lies in euphemism, in turning harsh reality into palatable phrases. The economics of spells, it's worth remembering, diagnostic spells are not just cultural. They are economic. A diagnosis unlocks insurance coverage, pharmaceutical prescriptions, workplace accommodations. Without the spell, none of these exists. With it, entire industries flourish. The DSM is revised every decade or so, and with each edition, new diagnoses appear. Critics like Alan Francis, chair of DSM-IV, have admitted that the manual risks turning everyday life into a mental disorder. But the economic incentives are enormous. Each new diagnosis can justify new treatments, new markets, new interventions. In this sense, diagnostic language is less like neutral classification and more like spellcraft tied to commerce. The words don't just describe illness, they generate demand, revenue, and dependency. Silence against the spell, yet language is not absolute. I return here to what I experienced in meditation, in stillness, the moment when my consciousness broke open and no words were present. That awakening taught me that reality exists beyond diagnostic categories. My body, my being, my awareness were not reducible to labels. This is where silence becomes resistance. When trauma silences us, it is often devastating, a wound without words. But when chosen, silence can also be a counterspell. Refusing the diagnostic label, refusing the jargon, refusing the imposed narrative is its own act of magic. It is a way of reclaiming identity from the enchantments of authority. Linguistics of diagnosis. From a linguistic perspective, diagnostic language operates through several mechanisms. Nominalization, turning processes into things. Depressed mood becomes depression. Once nominalized, it feels like an entity, a thing that exists independently rather than a shifting state. Metaphor, describing the mind as a machine with malfunctions or the brain as chemically imbalanced. These metaphors frame reality, guiding treatment and identity. Pragmatics, the authority of the speaker matters. You are bipolar, uttered by a psychiatrist, carries far more force than the same words spoken by a friend. The context makes the spell binding. Discourse. Once a diagnostic category enters discourse, media, policy, education, it becomes self-reinforcing. The category is not just medical, it becomes cultural. In all these ways, the DSM and related systems show how linguistics and power entwine. Diagnosis is language in action, creating realities rather than merely describing them. Personal reflection. Under and beyond the spell, I can't ignore the way these spells shaped me. For years, I carried diagnostic labels as though they were names etched into my being. Autism, ADHD, bipolar type 2, each one shifted how I saw myself, how others saw me. Sometimes they brought clarity, sometimes they brought stigma. They always carried weight. But what broke the spell was not rejecting the reality of my struggles. It was recognizing that the labels were not the whole story, that the DSM was not scripture but spellbook, that behind every diagnostic phrase was a choice, a way of framing, not the essence of reality itself. And when I embraced that, I began to reframe myself, not as a list of categories, but as a person in process, not as a pathology, but as a being alive to the complexity of experience. The scientific and diagnostic spell shows us how authority, classification, and objectivity can enchant us into identities and systems of control. But this spell is only one layer. Beyond the clinic and the lab lies another realm, politics. Because if diagnostic language defines who we are, political language defines the worlds we inhabit. Propaganda, euphemism, discourse, these are not accidents. They are spells designed to shape perception at scale. Next, we'll step into the political spell, the incantations of power that bind entire societies. Reflection prompt. Think of a time when a word from an authority figure defined you. Diagnosis, a label, a category. How did it shape the way you thought about yourself? Did you accept it, resist it, carry it? Activity. 1. Take one label you've been given, medical, educational, or otherwise. 2. Write it down on a piece of paper. 3. Underneath, write 3 alternative framings. Instead of disorder, what if it were difference? Instead of deficit, what if it was style? Instead of illness, what if it were experience? 4. Sit with the shift. Notice how different words cast different spells on your sense of self. The political spell. If the scientific and diagnostic spell works on individuals, the political spell works on whole societies. This is the domain where words don't just name conditions or categories, but orchestrate mass perception. Here, language is a battlefield, a theatre, and a weapon. Propaganda, euphemism, slogans, and slogans repeated until they sound like truth. These are the incantations of power. And just as the DSM functions like a modern grimoire for mental health, political speech operates like a ritual chant for collective reality. Nations are built on spells. Wars are justified by spells. Freedoms are restricted by spells. What changes is not the mechanics of enchantment, but its scale. The politics of naming political power begins with naming. The difference between terrorist and freedom fighter, refugee and illegal immigrant, civilian casualty and collateral damage is not semantic hair splitting. It is spellwork. One term condemns, another legitimizes. One invites sympathy, another dehumanizes. The words chosen don't simply describe events. They frame moral judgment and shape collective action. Linguists call this framing theory. George Lakoff has written extensively on it. Frames are mental structures that shape how we see the world. When politicians argue over whether to call something tax relief or tax cut, they aren't debating economics, they're debating enchantments. Relief implies taxes are a burden. Cut suggests trimming excess. Both cast different spells on the public imagination. Propaganda as enchantment propaganda is spell work at scale. It uses repetition, imagery, and emotional triggers to bypass rational critique. Think of wartime posters, loose lips sink ships, Uncle Sam wants you. These are incantations meant to bind citizens to obedience and sacrifice. Modern propaganda is subtler but no less potent. News headlines frame conflicts in particular ways. Clashes erupted, as if violence is spontaneous and agentless. Security forces neutralized threats, as if killing is mere technical maintenance. Each phrase is a spell of erasure, masking human agency behind euphemism. In the Inversiverse, I wrote about how narratives shape perception at scale, especially during crises like COVID-19. Flatten the curve, new normal, essential worker, phrases repeated until they became reality. These were not neutral words. They were linguistic tools to mobilize, pacify, and direct behavior. Ritualized repetition like ancient chants, political spells rely on repetition. At rallies, slogans are shouted until they stick. Yes, we can. Make America great again. Take back control. In Parliament or Congress, catchphrases are rehearsed until they dominate debate. Weapons of mass destruction. National security. Even hashtags like #MeToo or Black Lives Matter function as modern chants, repeated, shared, and circulated until they summon visibility and solidarity. Not all repetition is sinister, some spells empower, but the mechanism is the same. Words repeated ritualistically until they shape perception and behavior. Euphemism as cloak euphemism is perhaps the most insidious form of political spell work. Governments rarely say they spy on citizens. They say they collect data. They don't admit to torture. They say enhanced interrogation. They don't kill civilians. They report collateral damage. Euphemism is linguistic white magic turned dark, words that soften, obscure, and disguise harsh realities. Orwell's Newspeak in 1984 was a direct critique of this. Control the words, and you control thought. Make brutality sound bureaucratic, and resistance falters. Media as spellcaster. In the digital age, media is the primary conduit of political spellcasting. Headlines are crafted to frame perception instantly. A single phrase can tilt an entire narrative. Protesters clash with police, implying equal aggression, versus police attack protesters, implying asymmetry. Algorithms amplify certain narratives while muting others. This is where the political spell overlaps with the algorithmic spell, when platforms themselves become the ritual stage. Entire realities fracture into echo chambers, each bound by its own linguistic enchantments. Personal reflection. Seeing the spell, I felt the pull of these spells in my own life. During the pandemic, the constant repetition of phrases like stay safe, protect the NHS, or trust the science created an atmosphere that was more than information. It was enchantment. The phrases were designed to align behavior, to produce compliance. Whether one agreed or disagreed, the spell was inescapable. Writing the Inversiverse, I began to see these patterns more clearly. How certain headlines spread not because they were truer, but because they were more enchanting. How outrage was engineered through carefully chosen words. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. The world was a web of political spells, some blatant, others invisible. The linguistic mechanics of political spells. From a linguistics perspective, political language often uses presupposition. When did you stop supporting corruption? Already assumes guilt. Metaphor. The war on drugs, fighting poverty, flood of immigrants. Metaphors frame problems as battles or natural disasters, shaping how they're addressed. Pronouns. We the people. They are a threat. Pronouns draw boundaries, creating in-groups and out-groups. Modal verbs. We must act. We cannot wait. Urgency is conjured through linguistic mood. Each mechanism is a small spell, shaping perception before conscious thought has time to resist. Activity. Do a 24-hour linguistic audit. Spend own day noting the political language you encounter, headlines, social media posts, speeches, even casual conversations. Write down the keywords or phrases. Then ask 1. What reality is this language constructing? 2. What is being highlighted and what is being concealed? 3. Who benefits from this framing? At the end of the day, review your notes. You may find that much of what you consumed was less about informing you and more about enchanting you. The political spell shows how words orchestrate collective perception, how entire societies can be bound or liberated by the choice of phrases. But in the digital age, something new has emerged. Spells are no longer cast only by leaders, parties, or institutions. They are automated. Algorithms predict, amplify, and curate language at scale, casting millions of microspells every second. This is the algorithmic spell, and it may be the most powerful enchantment yet, not because it's stronger than ancient incantations, but because it's invisible, constant, and everywhere. The algorithmic spell. When I explored the political spell, I described how leaders, governments, and institutions wield words as incantations to shape collective perception. But today, the most powerful spellcasters are not ministers at podiums or editors in newsrooms. They are algorithms. Algorithms don't chat in public squares. They don't stand in courtrooms or on campaign stages. They hum quietly in the background, deciding what you see, what you hear, what you believe is important, and by extension, what you forget. This is spell work that has been automated. Millions of micro incantations are performed every second, invisible yet constant. From slogans to systems. Once upon a time, spellcasting was centralized. A monarch declared by the power vested in me, and reality shifted. A priest intoned a prayer, and the congregation followed. A general barked charge, and soldiers moved. Today, the locus of enchantment has shifted from speech to systems. When an algorithm decides which posts trend, which words are censored, which videos autoplay, it is casting spells not one to many, but one to each. Each person lives under a slightly different enchantment, tuned by predictive models that learn their triggers. Instead of one rallying slogan, millions of personalized ones. Your feed, your notifications, your search results. Linguistics of automation. From a linguistic lens, what's most striking is how algorithms reshape not just what we read, but how we speak. Consider autocorrect. You begin to type, and the machine predicts the word you want. Over time, it nudges you towards certain phrases, discourages unusual spellings, even erases dialectal quirks. This is predictive orthography as enchantment, smoothing individuality into statistical averages. Then there's predictive text. How many times have you accepted your phone's suggestion rather than finishing the sentence yourself? The device completes your thought, subtly training you to rely on its phrasings. Language narrows, predictability increases, and nuance decreases. This is where the algorithmic spell becomes insidious. When the mechanics of communication themselves are automated, the very range of possible expression contracts. The meme as micro-spell memes might look like harmless humor, but under the algorithmic spell, they become enchantments of mass coordination. Take the Leonardo DiCaprio smug pointing meme. On the surface, it's just an image, but when paired with text and repeated endlessly, it carries meaning that bypasses explanation. It says, I recognize this, I belong to this group, I get the joke. Algorithms amplify memes because they travel fast. Their enchantment lies in brevity and recognizability. They don't argue, they insinuate. They are linguistic spells disguised as entertainment. One click, one share, one laugh, and a worldview spreads further. Invisible rituals. What makes algorithmic spellcasting uniquely powerful is its invisibility. When you attend a rally, you know you're hearing slogans. When you read a manifesto, you know it's persuasive text. But when you scroll through a feed, the spell feels like reality itself. You don't notice the curation. You think you're choosing freely when in fact you're being guided. The rituals are daily mundane. The red badge on an app that calls you to open it. The autoplay video that lures you into the next hour. The trending topic that defines what feels urgent. None of these is neutral. Each is a micro-enchantment, subtle nudges shaping behavior and attention. Reflections from my work in the Inversiverse and Unfiltered Human. I've often written about perception under pressure, how systems manipulate thought and behavior. The algorithmic spell is perhaps the purest example of this. It doesn't need overt coercion. It thrives on invisibility. I've watched how friends, colleagues, even myself have slipped into thought loops, curated by feeds. Outrage one day, despair the next, then distraction, then numbness. The language of posts wasn't just reflecting reality. It was scripting moods, pacing conversations, aligning collective states of mind. This isn't conspiracy, it's observable. And once seen, it changes how you interact with the machine. Linguistic contraction and homogenization. What's lost under the algorithmic spell is linguistic diversity. Social platforms reward short, punchy, easily digestible content. Nuance is punished, complexity sinks. Dialects are filtered out. Minority languages are underamplified. Instead, memes and catchphrases dominate, a narrowing of expression into formulae that travel fast. It's as if algorithms prefer incantations to conversations. Mantras repeated endlessly, stripped of context, optimized for reaction. From a linguistic standpoint, this is homogenization disguised as connection. We appear to be living in a golden age of expression, but in reality, our words are funneled through systems that reward predictability and conformity. The algorithm is spellcaster. Who then is the sorcerer? The coder, the corporation, or the algorithm itself? When Facebook's recommendation engine radicalizes users toward extremist groups, was that intentional spellcasting or an emergent property of the system? When TikTok amplifies certain sounds, dances, and phrases, turning them into global rituals, is that design or accident? In truth, it doesn't matter. What matters is that the enchantment works. The algorithm has become the sorcerer's apprentice, casting spells endlessly without full oversight, reshaping language and behavior as it goes. Activity 1. For 1 week, pay attention to the predictive text suggestions on your phone. 2. Keep a log of the words it recommends most often. 3. Ask, how many of those words or phrases truly reflect me? How many feel like someone else's voice intruding into my language? At the end, reflect on whether your digital tools are expanding your expression or narrowing it. The algorithmic spell is powerful precisely because it is hidden. It doesn't announce itself with robes or altars. It whispers in autocomplete hashtags, memes, and trending topics. But if spells are real, and they are, then so are counterspells. The next part is about breaking and recasting, how we can unweave enchantments, notice their mechanisms, and craft language that resists manipulation. And it's also where I'll weave in something I've been developing across all my work, the mirror linguistic hypothesis and nervous system language. Because breaking spells isn't just about critique, it's about finding ways to recast words that heal, regulate, and empower. Breaking and recasting spells lose their power when we name them. That has always been the paradox. Seeing the spell ancient traditions intuited this truth in story after story. The demon defeated by knowing its secret name. The trickster outwitted when its incantation is repeated back. The curse undone when spoken aloud in public. What cannot be seen binds us. What is revealed, even partially, begins to loosen its grip. The same principle applies today. The most powerful spells of modernity, the scientific, diagnostic, political, and algorithmic enchantments we explored in earlier parts, operate best when invisible, when we repeat them as common sense, when disorder sounds like a neutral description, when national security feels beyond question, when the data shows passes as unchallengeable truth. But the moment we pause and say, this is a spell, something changes. We don't fully escape it. No one can live outside language entirely. But we do create distance, a crack in the glass, a place to breathe. This is where the work of breaking and recasting begins. It is not enough to see spells, we must also unweave them. And then crucially, we must learn to craft our own, because language will always be spell work. The question is not whether we live under spells, but whose spells we inhabit. The task is to reclaim the role of spellcaster. The mechanics of counterspells linguistics gives us a clue here. The philosopher J.L. Austin described speech acts, utterances that don't just describe but perform. Saying I promise, I apologize, or I declare this meeting open doesn't report an action. It is the action. A spell is nothing more and nothing less than a heightened speech act. So what is a counterspell? It is a speech act that reverses, undermines, or reconfigures the power of another. It is a linguistic maneuver that disrupts enchantment. Humor as spell-breaking satire has long been one of humanity's most potent counterspells. Court jesters survived not because they lacked danger, but because their ridicule disarmed the sovereign's words. By laughing at the king's decree, they punctured its aura. We see the same in modern memes. Authoritarian slogans are undone by parody. Corporate branding is subverted by remix. The moment we laugh, the spell is weakened. Reclaiming the word reclamation is another form of counterspell. Think of the word queer. Once wielded as an insult, it has been reclaimed as identity, banner, and community. The sting of the word was not erased, but transmuted. The curse became a sigil of pride. This is linguistics as alchemy. Words change not only by dictionary definition but by collective use, by communities daring to reframe them. Irony and inversion irony, too, break spells. When an incantation is repeated with a raised eyebrow, its power falters. Think of the way phrases like thoughts and prayers have been ironized online. Once solemn, now they often signal critique, pointing out hollowness. Inversion has similar effect. To take a phrase like disorder and flip it to difference, to turn patient into navigator, to call propaganda what it is, rather than information. These are counterspells not because they erase words, but because they redirect them. Critical thinking as spell-breaking humor, irony, and reclamation are cultural weapons. But on the individual level, there is another tool, critical thought. The Socratic method is perhaps the oldest form of linguistic counterspell. By asking relentless questions, Socrates unraveled the enchantments of Athenian common sense. He showed that beneath seemingly solid words lay contradictions, assumptions, illusions. Modern critical thinking plays a similar role. To ask who benefits from this phrase, to pause before retweeting a slogan, to notice when emotion is being hijacked by word choice. This is why slowing down matters. Spells thrive on speed and repetition. Lock her up works not because it's true, but because it is chanted. Breaking news works not because it's always urgent, but because it overwhelms. The counterspell is paused, reflection, asking, what is happening to me when I hear these words? What world do they make real? Recasting words breaking spells is necessary, but not sufficient. If we only deconstruct, we end in silence or cynicism. The deeper work is to recast word, to consciously create language that liberates. Language reclamation movement's history gives us many examples. Civil rights leaders insisted on new names, Negro to Black to African American. Feminists redefined woman from passive to powerful. Disability activists reframed handicapped into differently abled and then into proud disabled identities that reject pity. Each shift was a recasting, not waiting for dictionaries, but reshaping language by use. Poetry and story, as spellwork poets have always understood this. To write a metaphor is to enchant perception, to open new realities. Storytelling, too, is collective spellcraft, building shared myths, shared symbols. When I wrote the Inversiverse, I saw this firsthand. By reframing propaganda as illusion, by calling indoctrination a spell, I didn't just analyze language, I recast it. I offered another frame through which listeners could see. Recasting is not persuasion, it is opening. It is saying, here is another spell, try it on, see how the world feels under it. Mirror linguistic hypothesis and nervous system language. This is where my own recent explorations come in. I call it the mirror linguistic hypothesis, MLH. The idea that the language we use resonates through mirror neuron systems, shaping not only thought but nervous system states. Words do not merely transfer meaning, they co-regulate bodies. If I speak to you harshly, your pulse changes. If I speak softly, your breath slows. If I use certain rhythms, your nervous system entrains. Language is not only semantic, it is physiological. This opens a new dimension of spell work. The most powerful spells are not those that persuade the mind, but those that soothe or shock the body. From here, I began developing nervous system language, NSL, an attempt to craft a lexicon and grammar deliberately tuned to regulate rather than dysregulate, a language of grounding rather than collapse, of expansion rather than constriction. Imagine collaboration between human and AI in developing NSL, algorithms trained not just on efficiency or prediction, but on resonance, identifying words, tones, and rhythms that stabilize the nervous system. Imagine classrooms where children are taught not only grammar and spelling, but nervous system aware phrasing. Imagine therapy that integrates NSL as core practice. Not tell me your problem, but let's find words that your body can rest inside. This is visionary, but it begins with a simple observation. Spells already shape our physiology. Advertising hijacks dopamine. Political slogans spike cortisol. Diagnoses shape posture, breath, identity. If language can dysregulate, then language can also heal. MLH and NSL are proposals for recasting spell work toward wholeness. And this ties back to everything I've written. My Inner Child Was Broken showed how words spoken in childhood fracture the nervous system. The Unfiltered Human explored shadow emotions and the words that both reveal and repress them. The Inversiverse traced the spells of power. Now, the Linguaverse points toward crafting new spells of regulation and liberation. This is recasting at its most radical, not just new words, but new nervous system worlds, living counterspells. How do we bring this down from theory to practice? The answer is small daily acts. Choosing to name ourselves consciously, not only by imposed labels. Using humor when propaganda presses too hard. Practicing silence when noise overwhelms. Speaking to others with nervous system awareness, noticing when our tone constricts or expands them. Counterspells are not only grand rituals, they are the micro choices of everyday speech. Every I'm enough, whispered against an inner critic. Every reclaimed slur spoken with pride. Every refusal to repeat a hollow slogan. Living counterspells means recognizing that language will always enchant, but we can choose enchantments of care, truth, and possibility. Activity, the Counterspell Journal. Here's something to try. 1. Identify a spell word. A word that has acted like a spell in your life, diagnosis, insult, stereotype, or cliche. 2. Refuse it, write it down. Cross it out. Feel the refusal in your body. 3. Reclaim or replace it. Invent a counterword. Maybe it's playful. Maybe it's serious. Maybe it's poetic. 4. Repeat it. Use it in sentences. Notice how your nervous system shifts. 5. Record, keep a journal. Each week, add a new counterspell. Track how your world changes. Over time, you'll see the pattern. The world doesn't only cast spells on you. You cast spells on the world. Spells cannot be escaped. Language is spell work, and to live as a human is to live within it. But we are not helpless. We can break, unweave, and recast. We can craft languages of healing, regulation, and liberation. We can teach ourselves and our children not just to spell words, but to spell worlds. And this brings us to the next question, one that pulls us into the final movement of this arc. If language itself is the ultimate spell, then what happens when words run out? What lies beyond the spell, beyond speech, beyond language? That is where we go next in episode 16, The Last Word. Spells, then, are not just something we inherit, they are something we can reframe, resist, or recast. Critical thinking is one counterspell, not the dry, mechanistic logic chopping taught in school, but a living attentiveness to how words operate. Noticing when a headline manipulates mood, when a label shrinks possibility, when a phrase is smuggling in assumptions. Art is another. Poets, musicians, storytellers, they have always been the unofficial spellbreakers of their time. Every metaphor cracks an old frame and opens a new one. Every satirical joke is a pin to the inflated language of power. And then there is community. The strongest counterspells are rarely solitary. They are spoken together in solidarity, in dialogue, in shared refusal. When groups reclaim a word once used against them, they flip the enchantment. When families rewrite old stories of shame, they weaken the curse. Breaking spells does not mean banishing words entirely. It means seeing through their invisible power, loosening their grip, and deciding whether to accept, reject, or reshape them. But breaking is only half the work. The other half is recasting, to speak in ways that affirm life rather than diminish it, to coin new words where old ones wound, to revive forgotten expressions of dignity, reciprocity, awe, to experiment with language as if each sentence were a seed. Because if language has always been spell work, then the future of the spell depends on how we choose to wield it. Not whether we will be under spells, we always will, but which ones we inhabit, which ones we resist, and which ones we write ourselves. And that brings us here, to the closing of this episode, and almost the closing of this arc. The future of the spell leads naturally to the question of endings themselves. What happens when language runs out, when it reaches its last word? That is the path we walk in the next episode. But before we step forward, we need to pause, gather the strands, and close this circle. Language has never been neutral. From the first chants around the fire to the latest algorithm scanning your feed, words have always carried more than meaning. They carry force. They summon, they bind, they wound, they heal. They are the oldest human technology of power. When I look back across this episode, from ancient incantations to scientific diagnoses, from political propaganda to algorithmic whispers, what strikes me is continuity. The costumes change, the context shifts, but the structure remains. The spell is always the same. Language plus belief plus repetition equals reality. The linguist J.L. Austin called these performative utterances. To say is to do. I pronounce you husband and wife. I declare this law in effect. You are under arrest. In each case, the words are not describing something. They are enacting it. Ancient magicians knew this. Modern bureaucrats know it too. The danger is forgetting that spells can be rewritten. Too often, we take words as fixed, natural, and inevitable. The DSM reads like a grimoire, not because its categories are eternal, but because they are spoken with the authority of science. Political slogans sound like common sense because they are repeated until they sink beneath notice. Algorithmic recommendations feel natural because they echo back our habits until we mistake feedback for truth. But when we pause, when we examine the language itself, the spell flickers. We see that categories shift over decades, that slogans contradict, that recommendations are engineered. The illusion of inevitability weakens. And in that moment of awareness, new possibilities open. This is why linguistics matters, not as a dry science of parsing grammar, but as a way of unmasking enchantment. Semantics shows us how meaning is negotiated. Pragmatics shows us how context changes force. Sociolinguistics reveals how power hides in dialect and register. Historical linguistics shows that every truth of language is provisional, already mutating. And it is why philosophy matters. Because the spell is not just about syntax or semantics. It is about ontology, about what counts as real. When Foucault speaks of regimes of truth, or when Wittgenstein writes that the limits of my language mean the limits of my world, they are naming the same reality. Language does not just describe the world, it builds the scaffolding of the world we live in. But I also want to insist on hope here. The spell is not only domination, it is also liberation. Words have been used to wound, yes, but also to heal. They have been used to control, yes, but also to resist. Think of abolitionists redefining slavery as a crime against humanity. Feminists are reframing hysterical as a sexist slur rather than a diagnosis. Civil rights activists reclaiming dignity in the face of degradation. LGBT+ communities are taking back slurs as badges of pride. Each of these is an act of counter-spellcasting, and on a smaller scale, each of us has done this. Each time we refuse a label that confines us. Each time we choose a different word to describe ourselves. Each time we name an experience that was once unspeakable. This, to me, is the future of the spell. Not the end of spells, but the recognition of them. Not a fantasy of being beyond enchantment, but a conscious choice of which enchantments to inhabit. And here is the paradox. The moment we name spells, we are already casting one. Even the word spell is a spell. It frames language as enchantment, as power. It reminds us of the stakes, which is why the closing of this episode matters. It is not just a conclusion. It is itself a performative act, a ritual of closure, a binding of threads. Reflection prompt think back across your life. What is one word or phrase that has acted like a spell on you? A label, a slogan, a mantra, something that shaped how you saw yourself or the world. Sit with it, ask, who first spoke it? What power did it carry? Does it still hold you, or have you broken it? Activity, create a counterspell journal. On one page, write down words you refuse, e.g. labels, phrases, or slogans you will no longer let define you. On another page, write down words you reclaim, ones that were once used against you, but now feel like sources of strength. And on a third page, invent words you create, playful, poetic, experimental terms that capture realities no dictionary yet contains. Return to this journal as often as you like. Let it grow with you, because every entry is an act of spell breaking and spell making. Every entry is an act of conscious enchantment. As we close, I want to leave you with this. The spell is not going away, but that is not cause for despair. It is cause for vigilance, for creativity, for courage. The ancient spell reminds us that words carry force. The scientific and diagnostic spell shows how authority codifies enchantment. The political spell demonstrates how language builds nations and wars. The algorithmic spell warns us that machines are now part of the chorus, and the counterspell invites us to speak otherwise to craft new incantations. This is not abstract, it is daily. It is every conversation, every headline, every post, every inner dialogue. It is in your mouth right now as you listen to my words and feel them shape your thoughts. So as we end episode 15, let us step lightly but firmly. Let us notice the spells we are under, the spells we resist, and the spells we dare to write. And so we close another circle. The future of the spell is not about leaving enchantment behind, but about learning to see it, to name it, to wield it wisely. Every word we speak is already a spell. The only question is whether we cast unconsciously or with intention. In our next and final episode of Arc 2, we arrive at episode 16, The Last Word. This is where we bring the threads together, where we ask not just about spells or silence, but about endings themselves, about whether there can ever truly be a last word in a world where language never stops shifting. Until then, stay curious, stay awake to your own language, and remember, every spell can be broken, but every word you speak is already a spell in the making. You've been listening to the Linguaverse, James Miller.